A lot of people that have been hanging around GSAPP for many a year. Richard is one. Okay, welcome, yes. Richard is one who has been, I think, professor there the longest, and he has been the director of the architecture program, also the urban design program, now the urban design lab. But back in the day when I think James and I were graduate students there, Richard was the person who was the drill down expert on housing, who had cornered the market in the topic of housing, which I think was also a kind of epidemic at that time at Columbia. Right? Everybody was interested in housing, but Richard was the one who was carrying forward the study, which was going to be, everybody knew, the definitive study. And indeed, in 1990, it did come out as the definitive study of the history of housing in New York City. And it stayed just like this from 1990 until 2016, when a new edition has added a last chapter or so to this encyclopedia. I do. And you can see. And you can see how much used. I had to take a lot of the markers, the post-it markers, out of it just for this occasion. Richard is the go-to person in the history of housing in New York. This is the Bible that everybody consults, the footnoted study, in order to talk about the evolution of any kind of typology in New York housing across private and public. And although I think that the public aspect of it is the one that we'll see that you favor, perhaps. And I have to confess that my own interest in the Skyscraper Museum and the high-rise, which will be represented by James Sanders tonight, when we kind of focus on Tudor City as an example of a high-rise, high-density solution to the future of New York that might have been continuous development, all but for the interruption of the Great Depression. I have to confess that my own interest in the history of the high-rise, rather than of housing, came out of a fascination with urban development and a belief that the history of real estate, you couldn't tell the history of a city without telling the history of real estate. And so commercial architecture, which was not considered particularly at that time a legitimate area for someone who was in the art history department, as I was, specializing in architectural history, that was a bit of an outlier in the academic profile. So, but all of these things were going on at the same time, so it's kind of a delight to be able to revisit that these some 30 years later. So I said this is the second in a series of talks, and some of you came on Tuesday for the first talk, which you will soon be able to see on our website in a video version, when Zachary Violet talked about the decorated tenement and kind of expanded our understanding of the tenement, which I wanted to refer to briefly here with this set of slides, because what we're positing tonight is that there are two solutions. The topic of the talk, which is out and up, out or up in the 1900s and 1920s, that at the beginning of the 20th century, the private market needed to replace the expansive neighborhoods of tenements that had been built from the 1860s, but especially the 1880s and 90s forward. And I went past the one I want to say. And just to remind you and to suggest that if you read your way through the exhibition from the opening at the top of the ramp, this image, which was always the one that's kind of spurred my thinking about how to interpret that photograph and to frame some of the issues of the exhibition, is the not very clear view of the Taylor map of 1879. And what it shows you is that practically every bit of Manhattan Island was completely built over by private property where land had been purchased by individuals and entrepreneurs built at a fairly small scale and at a fairly low rise, but at very high density, you can see. And this was the nature of New York well into the 1940s, when you see here the transformation of the urban landscape that comes in especially in the post-war period, but is already prefaced here, as these areas of tenements are replaced by of private development, or replaced by a landscape of publicly funded architecture. So that's what we wanted to investigate. That's one of the things we wanted to investigate in the show. And we'll let Nick talk about what he thinks the show is about later, but this is what I thought it was about going forward. In the show and on our website, where you can read Nick's essays that accompany each of these kind of sections of ideas that provide an overview and a timeline on the North Wall, we contrapose views of the moving out of the Lower East Side or other neighborhoods, but especially the Lower East Side, decentering and deconcentrating that area of 19th century crowding with a private market solution of garden apartments, and this is principally what Richard's going to talk about tonight. And you can see in one of the ads there where they're making it very clear that it's the subway that's going to allow this to happen. But the alternative to that, an in-town solution and a very capitalist solution, is exemplified at Tudor City, and James Sanders is going to talk about that. I didn't introduce James, I'll do that before he stands up to speak, I guess. And just to show you some other views of that, you can see, I think you know which part is Tudor. Does the laser pointer work? Anyway, it's right here. Tudor City is all of these buildings here, as you can see, with extraordinary density accomplished through high-rise development. And it's developed by really a visionary entrepreneur named Fred French, who, in addition to Tudor City, built Knickerbocker Village. This is realized with federal funds after the Great Depression has already started, but the land was started to be assembled before the stock market crash. And I like this slide in particular because you see the tenement districts. This is just south of the Manhattan Bridge. You can see that 14-story buildings are replacing 4-story buildings with a kind of logic of modernization of the slums that comes through high-rise development. And there's another developer that we're not talking about. I really have to call them builders rather than developers, which is both what they did and the kind of nomenclature of the period, at London Terrace, which is one of the featured projects in the exhibition because it affords a housing density of about 1,000 people per acre, which is the same as the slums of the Lower East Side at their most dense population and crowding historically. But the solution is high-rise development. And there's Fred French, pointing to the future. Here are some of his extraordinary portfolio that he built in a very short time, starting with single buildings of residential development, then going through skyscrapers, and then from 1925 to 27, assembling the land for Tudor City, and tenement house land, as you can see, the signs that Tudor City is coming in the future, and those are the buildings that will be torn down for the skyscrapers. He was also a genius at advertising. You can't see this very well, but this is 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, and you're pointing this way to Tudor City. It's just a short walk. So he was fighting that flight, not so much through the subway, but through the Westchester corridor of the railroad lines, the real suburbanization movement. So, and offering an alternative that would be in town, small scale flats for rising young executives or newly married. If you read the text, they talk about bachelor apartments. We have so much more to do in terms of research about Tudor City in order to really understand the buildings, but I'll just point out the word for you. It's a 22-story hotel, right? The reason these buildings could be so tall is that they were hotels under the zoning law rather than apartment buildings, which would have made them residential, which would have put them under the height cap of 150 feet in those days, and then by 1929, 300 feet. So they're all called hotel apartments. And just to show you some examples from the brochure, which is in that case right there, and how compact these units were, sometimes one bedroom. There was quite a variety of apartment sizes there. And here's Al Smith with the sledgehammer and Fred French, kind of steering into the future there over on the right with their photo op as they began to tear down the tenements on Madison Street where Al Smith was raised on the Lower East Side in order to create the site for Knickerbocker Village. And there's the engraved invitation for the wrecking of the slums by the Honorable Alfred E. Smith. These are all in the New York Public Library Fred French collection, and the construction of Knickerbocker Village. Some drawings that were a kind of extended fantasy of what might be built on the site that included more kind of specialized high-rises that you see there in the center, and it's these two units that were actually completed. And you see them in more drawings that are in the Fred French collection. And there they are at the opening, where Al Smith is gesturing to Fred French, looking very self-satisfied as they sit on the dais and celebrate the opening of Knickerbocker Village. And this is what the buildings looked like as they were just completing construction. And there again, seeing them in the context of the slums that they were beginning to modernize. And things got cut short by the stock market crash and the worsening depression. And I will step aside now, but remember to introduce James, since I've already given Richard, who will speak next, some background. James Sanders has, again, been a friend and colleague for many a year. He's an architect, a filmmaker, and an author. He, perhaps his most widely known production is as the co-writer and producer of New York, a documentary, the PBS film series that dates back to the 1990s, that has an accompanying volume that they wrote together, that Rick Burns and James wrote together. But then James has his own romantic evocation of New York, which is Celluloid Skyline, the book that he was working on every year that I saw him for at least a decade. I'd say, what are you working on? And that was the book that he was working on. It finally came out to phenomenal acclaim. I have since continued to work on dreamy projects about the New York skyline and skyscrapers as well, and has now a number of other projects ongoing. So James also has as the credential for his talk tonight in focusing on Tudor City that he was brought up there as a youth. So he's going to continue the romance of that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Richard.
Right.
Here, I hand this over to you.
We've got the wrong slides, the wrong slideshow.
Those are your, okay.
Okay, here, we get, no, let's do Jackson Heights first.
You wanted
Leo, the other. Wherever Leo.
I'm right here.
Oh, he's doing it right there.
Somebody's going to give you a little water.
Yes, right here.
Oh. All right, so it's great to see this exhibit. Great to be with all friends, acquaintances. Yeah, Ben was there. When were you?
80-something.
I'm class of 82. I'm
So were you?
84. 84.
She's a representative from Sunnyside.
Queens.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, time passes. Only frantic has yes, 6 months on me, I think. But he's a little older, but he's doing very well. So I'm just going to be informal. I have quite a few slides. I'm going to hit things that I think are important to say. You can interrupt. That's okay.
Sure.
Discussion. I didn't know whether to put out in Queens or up in Queens, or up and out in Queens, but anyway. So we'll look a little bit at the drivers, which were, of course, you had the high-rise innovation technically. We also had the low-rise innovation, which was transit, and in a way, Queens, Bronx as well, but really Queens was really very focused and quick example of how that technology develops. It's very quick. In the BRT, the IRT, one train goes in 1904, gets extended in 1907. And the 7 train goes in, I'm going to remember all these dates, but the 7 train is basically going through farmland. There's a little bit of development on the rear side. Steinway goes out there much earlier. They're trying to get the workers out of the city because there was too much discussion going on in the pubs and whatnot, and there were strikes and that sort of thing. So that was early motivation, but the massive thing happens with the transportation. So this is a Colton map, I think, of that dates, 1886. And you see the logic of the extension of the north-south axis of Manhattan. This is, of course, pre-subway, but these are the elevated trains, and they basically connect into the Bronx. So the South Bronx gets hit with density. It's basically kind of tenement spillover, and you still see some of that up there. But on the eastern side, there's really nothing. So Brooklyn Bridge goes in, Manhattan Bridge, and that sort of thing, but it's not until, essentially, till the 7 train goes in, this gets opened up. Long Island Railroad was there, but that was not a 5-cent fare. So we're talking about mass movement, mass building, and mass transportation. It's an interesting discussion, but actually, how much time do we have?
You have 20 minutes.
We won't discuss the discussion. Of course, here's the IRT, the 1 train going in, and the lateral lines are there. That's Broadway. I don't know where that is. Never located that on Broadway. But I think another distinction is land development techniques. And of course, for the Bronx, there were the mass transit lines would go in, and then there would be parceling, and that parceling tended to be sold in a fairly haphazard way. In other words, you could buy a single lot, you could buy the whole thing or whatever. This happens to be, I think this is William Astor's estate here, and this is where the Mount Morris racetrack was, and there's a whole bunch of these very interesting maps. This is kind of fuzzy here in the public library. You can see exactly what they did. They even had the auctions in the subway stations, and of course, the folks investing in the subway were also owning the land. So it's old money, and they figured out what to do next. And then there are ethnic differences. Of course, this is from Deborah Dashmore's very interesting work now quite a few years ago, but basically the in-migrations would go from the Lower East Side, Jewish population up to the Bronx or central Brooklyn, and the Anglo populations were into other things, like Jackson Heights. So the big distinctions about who moved where, and of course, and about the building itself. I mean, the labor co-ops in the Bronx were, basically cooperative built by unions. The amalgamated complex is still up there, of course. Many of the others failed in the Depression. The buildings are still there. song. And we have this period in the 20s of just massive changes. I mean, these are African Americans in Harlem in 1920 and 1930. So who were they displacing and where would they go? Well, Harlem was fairly diverse, but still, people tended to end up outside of Manhattan or maybe way up the other end, inward and places like that, based on ethnicity, ideology, of course, in the case of the co-ops, a bunch of factors. And this is a furrier in, he was with Amalgamated, he moves up to the Bronx. This is his son, of course. You see these huge generational differences. So the question is, I'm supposed to talk about Jackson Heights. So what about Jackson Heights? Well, Queens was not accessible to those folks, the furriers, the garment workers, or the Irish, or leftover Irish from somewhere, downtown or whatever. So this is, of course, the Long Island Railroad, the Forest Hill Station. Here it is, all mapped out for us.
Excuse me, why wasn't Queens accessible to?
Well, they couldn't afford it.
Transportation.
Yeah, they couldn't afford it. And you could get there, you could get to Forest Hills.
Right.
That wasn't pleasant.
It was also restricted.
Well, that's,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, I'll come to that. I think I had a slide for that. And then here it is, of course. But yeah, here it was, of course, Russell Sage Foundation. Sorry, these are kind of fuzzy, but very fuzzy. But anyway, in this disclaimer, they start Forest Hills as a working class community, and within a year or two figure out that business plan isn't going to work, right? So they immediately switch, and that's what this ad is all about. So suddenly this is an upper middle class, whatever, community, and that's what it became. Jackson Heights was exactly that category. Jackson Heights is a little, step down in the class structure. All right, so that gets us to the transportation. Then there's the garden apartment itself, because what gets pioneered at Jackson Heights is pretty different than, let's say, the Jewish co-ops up in the Bronx. They're higher density. They're related to, the lower versions of like a Knickerbocker Village, the perimeters, the kind of continuous. And the notion of the public space is very different. So I'll explain it very quickly, I hope, how we get to the notion of an apartment in a garden as a priority. It's not an apartment in an urban space, in a street, in a hard space. It's something else. And that was part of the marketing. The marketing was very important in Jackson Heights. But anyway, a couple of things to just mention briefly. Yes, there's a 1916 zoning law, and it's, of course, usually, there's no point.
Yeah,
Well,
I
there's-
finally
yeah,
heard
there
it.
is. Of course, it governs building bulk and all that, but it also, very importantly, it starts to protect the outer borough areas through zoning. In World War I, there was a huge industrial expansion that happened. Of course, that was happening in peripheries. So there starts to be the problem of conflict between industry and the attraction of a borough like Queens, but there are other places as well, for housing, given the new transportation. That's one factor. This, of course, is another issue. This has to do with how architects like Andrew Thomas or a number of the others, Springsteen and Goldhammer, I forget who was who, but many of them were very young in the war and worked for the United States Housing Corporation, which built war housing with government money. Large projects. New York only had one proposal in Staten Island that wasn't built. But cities all across the country needed housing in order to service the new factories in the peripheries, and that was a training ground, a very important one. Not just for design, but also for management, for, conceiving of these very large projects. So in New York City, many of the architects that came back and worked in the 20s as young architects actually got their feet wet in the government programs as a form, of course, of military service. Rules changed as well. This is the 1921 tenement house competition. There were several competitions right around this time. The war is over. There's a claim of housing shortage. I don't know, soldiers are coming back and this and that. And so there were these tenement house competitions that would try to improve basically new law tenements. There was one, I think, in 1919, and this is a 21 one. But what I want to mention here is how Andrew Thomas over here changes everything. These were the 3 winning entries. This is our Sibley and Featherstone. So here's Andrew Thomas. This is 68% coverage. This is 60% coverage. And his argument, of course, he didn't win, and he was really pissed off about it. I mean, he was quite a character. By the way, he didn't study architecture. He's one of this generation of housers, you know, that were very important in that period. They weren't the elite, you know, Beaux-Arts types. Didn't go to Paris. You know, came up with Alfred Smith for sure. But anyway, his argument was that actually this was more profitable. And this flew in the face of standard thought, which was the more you could squeeze on the site, the more rooms you could get in there, the more profits. That's basically per room calculation. And his argument was, well, actually there's some less rooms here, but the quality of this thing is much better, the light is much better, air is much better, and you can actually charge more per room. And he did all these calculations. Very interesting studies. At least in situations like Jackson Heights in Queens, and you know, you mentioned another context, he was right, absolutely right. And this was the strategy used by the Queensboro Corporation, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's developed Jackson Heights and some other big projects. And basically Thomas goes on to do, for the next 10, 15 years, a whole series of variations on this T-shaped or U-shaped massing in various ways. And he does in the Jackson Heights experiments as well in many places. Okay, then we have the Queensboro Corporation the dates are kind of important here. Let's see. Yeah. The corporation was formed in 1909, and the head of it's a guy called Edwin McDougall. He almost went to jail with this maneuver because he bought, I think, 325 acres of farmland. He bought 6 farms here, and then lobbied the city to put the train 7 line across his farmland. Well, not across it, but on the side of it. Of course, he didn't want to mess up his development. With some, apparently some pretty shady strategies, which he almost ended up in jail, but he avoided it one way or another. And here you see the argument. 5-cent fare. I forget the time. These are all kind of fuzzy, but you know, it's like 12 minutes to Grand Central. So that was a very important calculation. How did he then decide on the character of the development, the typology involved. And we're looked at with some curiosity and interest. This is Palmettos, this is another one. You see these kind of what Thomas would go on to call double perimeters with pathways winding through. And of course, today, race green walls, etc. So that becomes the formula for Jackson Heights and the build out. And of course, the subway and fare is generating this, and we see along this line, I'll show you the Metropolitan Life project in a minute, but that, you know, there were a series of projects that move out and decrease in density till you get to Jackson Heights. But this is absolutely interesting typologically, and you can see the fluctuation in real estate values. Some blocks were more like 1 or 2 family houses, others were, you know, like the Chateau and the towers here were, you know, were really 6-story blocks. You get way out here at the end. This is Henrietta Smith, very interesting project. So there's a lot of typological variation, but I think what's probably most interesting is this Thomas strategy with the U shape. So we'll look at 5 sites, all by Thomas. There's some others here by Thomas and other architects, of course. But the other important thing to mention here is, unlike the Bronx projects, these were home ownership strategies. The corporation was in the business of selling real estate. And this, of course, is very, for this social class, this is the first time you're starting to see people build equity with their house, with their apartment. Very important development. And they tapped into that. And this has to do also with other issues like insurance industry, things like that. You can't buy something without insuring it. And, you know, it's not wise to do that, that sort of thing. This is the first project that goes in. This is the Greystone, which is actually designed by another architect, George Wells, who did quite a few interesting projects out here. And this is the first use that I know of garden apartment as an advertising brand, let's say. It's interesting because the garden was not, the two sides faced the street and the gardens were behind. And then they learned they better put the garden, the two sides with the garden. You know, it's very interesting how the thing develops. But this is only in a matter of very, I mean, just several years. The Greystone is, right, 1917, 18 already. Here's the street side, here's the back side, and here's the coverage formula. So they could advertise 60% garden per block, which was incredibly low compared to the co-ops in the Bronx, or certainly anything you could do in Manhattan, even northern Manhattan at that point. They cheated, however, because this 100-foot end block N was counted into the 60%, and as soon as they got people in here, of course they built something there. Yeah. So these were, very modern folks in terms of how to do real estate. Something about it. We'll see that in a minute. There it is, of course. And here are the gardens, which they allow people to garden in the land, because at this point, it was basically not much developed yet. So they're basically taking farmers' lands and making their gardens. And this had to do with World War I and the Victory Gardens thing here, which was very large. So people liked it. People were happy to to go out, have a decent apartment and a 5-cent fare and raise their own vegetables, as they had done during the war. Okay, so we'll finish up with Thomas. And just a little background before we look at Jackson Heights in terms of what he was doing there. But he already in 1919, for the New York State Reconstruction Committee for Housing, he was proposing these kind of block developments. New York State set up, and Albany set up this committee which was supposed to be looking at what the future for housing would be in the 20s and the shortage and all this kind of thing. And here's a project I don't believe ever built, but this is in Astoria in Queens, in which he's kind of arranging his U-shapes around a central garden. These are very early. This is 1917. He's got the calculations, which we can't read, but this is all pretty careful stuff. This is for City Suburban Homes, Homewood in Brooklyn, which was one of the first early projects by Thomas using the U form. This is 1920. I won't say a lot about it, but this is a Tuscan stage set. The interesting thing about this period also in Jackson Heights is social functionalism had not yet overridden fantasy. Let's say the notion of urban life as a theater, form of theater. When you go up to Concourse, you see some of those buildings. Jackson Heights, you see it, which are very scenographic. And he was an expert at that. This is the Tuscan Garden. This was more recently. The person's lost its Tuscan qualities. And finally, now we'll look at a few of those first projects, Thomas projects in Jackson Heights. This was on Hayes Avenue, Hayes Court, 1922. Here we see two of the big U blocks, and it's a very interesting project, very skillfully done. In this case, the scenography is France, kind of Chateau, but it's much more than that because he used this kind of mansardic language to lower the height of the building and to decrease the scale. These things were done very carefully. And there's a loggia that then feeds into the stairs at the corners. It's there, view through to the street view. But he was also just in from Jackson Heights, also doing the Metropolitan Life projects. Now, Metropolitan Life was allowed to invest in housing in 1922, I think. Yes. Insurance law was changed. Insurance law, life insurance was one of the big service industries. It really built out Lower Manhattan, by the way. And became very popular, but it was heavily controlled because you couldn't have insurance companies making stupid investments and losing people's life savings and that sort of thing. But with the housing shortage, the state tapped into insurance companies who had a huge amount of capital just floating around, and basically said, okay, you can invest that money in housing, but it had to be affordable. Well, this is the first public-private affordable whatever, I think, in this whole affordable discussion that goes on today. And they couldn't charge more than $8 a room, I think. And in this Metropolitan Life project was really the first enormous project. You can still, when you go out to 7, you can still see a few of these. One is off going out, it's off on the right side, about 2 or 3 blocks away. So this was not Jackson Heights brand, but it fit into the same discussion about typology, density, And it's a very interesting project that I won't go into in any detail, except here's the basic floor plan, and here's the kind of innovation that went into Thomas's units. They were too small to have a dining room, but they had what was called the Pullman here. And this was designed like the Pullman cars, Pullman dining cars, you know, it was the same thing, you just stuck it in there. So there were all these marketing devices, including, of course, Queensboro itself. Queensboro really pioneered marketing in the New York Times real estate section. If you go back and look there, you'll see all kinds of stuff. They used radio advertising, really pioneering. This is for, you know, by mid-20s, latest. Here is then just several projects in a chronological order. This is Linden Court, which is dated from 1920. This is middle income. But it's, if you want to talk about Pullman dining nooks, we can also talk about integrated automobiles. It's a very interesting project because it ramps down, and in the back you have parking tucked under. This is again 1920. Then you have a raised green landscape here, which tends to diminish the effect of the garages. Yeah, there it is. And here the raised green. Of course, the height's bulk is diminished with these things. They were called sun parlors, and you know, it was a pretty elaborate lexicon of things that we were pushing. Here's the sketches. Of course, it's just a door, but inexpensive and detail. It said door. Gargoyles from Tuscany. And here the street side, which landscape also played a very heavy role. So the street in the courtyard side. Then we come to the Chateau. And now we see the form of the T is morphing. And it's morphing because it has an elevator. So social class-wise, this is of course a step up. This is up the middle, upper middle. And the question was, well, how can you get, even for that, how can you get an elevator in each of these buildings? How, you know, why would that not make this basically unaffordable, period? And that in itself is an interesting story. Combining that technology with building code considerations. So in the Chateau, you could have a push-button elevator, so it doesn't need the elevator operator. I think it was 1917, the elevator operators union was broken. And at that time, the servo mechanism technology for the elevator switched from DC to AC, which meant you could do the buttons cheaply. Before you needed a rheostat thing, I guess. So that means that you had relatively inexpensive elevator, 6 floors, no operator, but the other important ingredient in all this formulas were that you could still have wood joist construction.
What kind?
Wood.
Wood.
Floors.
Oh, wood floors.
I mean, still needed brick between things, but you had the advantage up to 6 floors by building code of being able to frame that out of wood, which is what they did. So that's how they could arrive at this kind of elaborate formula for still relatively inexpensive housing. And of course, the land is cheap. You got the whole formula is working one thing against the other. It's Chateau, as you can see. And here's the elevator right here. This is the one project that survived the Depression, remained, I think it was remained continuous co-op till today. It's very beautifully maintained. Unfortunately, in recent years, the security paranoia means they've sealed off the gardens, but it used to be able, the public could go in there. Between buildings. Very beautiful. And of course, this was the block end, which does get filled up pretty fast. So that 60% garden got squished down to somewhere around 60% building. It kind of flipped. This was the golf course, I believe. The marketing for this was Anglo-Saxon. No Jews, no dogs. So the Jews are up in the Bronx, or central Brooklyn, and this is the escape place where the others are getting displaced, including the folks in Harlem. So the whole thing, it's like a chessboard, right? And then the project followed, and what is this? This is still the Chateau, yes, that's the end. And lot, where she gets filled. Here's the gardens. Also, landscaping is raised, not like the Linden Court, not as high, but this notion of, fairly subtle planes of green is used very effectively. This, I think, remains today some of the best housing in the city, if you want to live in Jackson Heights. It's incredible. So is Linden Court, and you can put your car there. And if we had bought something there 25 years ago, yes, we do very well. I don't know what Sunnyside costs these days, but... And this, of course, the street, again, the landscaping strategies. Then across the block, is the towers. This was the most high-end one, and of course, McDougall lived in this tower apartment here, so he could survey all the comings and goings. And it's Moorish, whatever Moorish might mean in Queens, which you can see here. And of course, the more rooms in the apartments, the U shapes are a little bigger. Here's the fantasy for the branding. And the block end before it gets built. In the garden, which has now been restored. It's back as a co-op. Of course, then Thomas goes on to do like Dunbar up in Harlem, Rockefeller money, although Rockefeller didn't stay in that game very long. And it evolves, the U shape evolves into the double perimeter. You see here, and here's his explanation of that kind of evolution. And of course, Dunbar is much higher density. But the same formula between building code, elevator, technology. And here's just a common one. This is not an elevator building in the Bronx, so you have a lot of this stuff going up in the Bronx. But Jackson Heights was interesting because of the vision that was employed. It was quite specific. This is more spec stuff. Well, it's quite good. And finally, there's that. The exact address up in the concourse, I think. This is 190 Morris Avenue, is up in that area. And then finally, this is a project of Thomas in 1920, which is again a very, there were two T-shaped floors in the courtyard. And I show this because it shows the vulnerability of this housing in spite of its qualities in the 60s, 70s, and the redlining that went on and all of that. Fortunately, Jackson Heights escaped that. but there are, of course, massive areas in the Bronx that didn't, the same housing basically. So if that housing were there today, maybe you could afford one, maybe who knows. But this is when I used to go. I used to go around with Camila Vergara, the photographer, and take pictures. So that's 1986. In I think it was November, and we were just shocked, gone. And we'd been there 2 weeks earlier.
Why did they take it down?
Well, that's a long story. I only mention it because to make a contrast, neighborhoods, but I should put it right.
Yeah, you need to James's turn.
But it's a disinvestment issues. Okay, sorry.
Hi, everybody. This is such a strange and lovely experience for me, in part because I did grow up in Tudor City. I moved there when I was 4, and I left when I was 12. So just the kind of magical years you remember, the place of childhood, that's the place I remember best. And also, all of this is strange for me because Carol remembers the decade I spent working on celluloid skyline. Before that, I spent another decade working on the history of residential housing and architecture in New York, a book in the drawer, so to speak, with an ex-partner, and thought a lot about these same issues. So, but it's a special pleasure to come and talk about Tudor City and this wonderful, Nick has done, I think, just a fantastic job here. And how do I do this? Like that? Yeah. I titled my talk, You Can Have It All, The Lessons of Tudor City. And I'm not going to tell you a detailed history of Tudor City. Rather, I want to do, as I said, draw out the lessons. I believe that the lessons of Tudor City are as valuable today as they have ever been. There's nothing nostalgic about what I'm going to talk to you about. I believe Tudor City is an extraordinary model of urban development that could be built tomorrow in many ways, and has so many of the values and reconciles so many of the seemingly oppositional issues of 20th century housing. Briefly, however, the project was built in the late 1920s. It stretches from 43rd Street to 40th Street. It's built essentially around 43rd, 42nd, and 41st Street. It's built on a promontory that runs parallel to the East River. It consists of 3 large apartment houses along what had been Prospect Place, then renamed Tudor Place. More apartment houses. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the differences. Additional buildings along 42nd Street and other smaller buildings around here. This is a view obviously looking east on 42nd Street. This was not tenement district. These were basically built as row houses. They were, by the time Tudor City was built, most of them as rooming houses. It was not considered an attractive part of New York, in part because the entire East River waterfront, what we now know as the site of the United Nations, was filled almost entirely with slaughterhouses. You can own, this was known, First Avenue was known as Blood Alley. You can imagine how wonderful that was. It leads to one of the strangest things about Tudor City, but an important formative thing about Tudor City, which is there are almost no views of the apartments to the east, because nobody wanted to look, or more importantly smell, what was going on over there. So the entire complex almost entirely faces west, and effectively you might argue what had to happen is that they had to create their own landscape, their own views, their own world by turning inward. But they did it in a very, very interesting way. This is what's called the hospital, I cannot make this up, for crippled and ruptured children, and was torn down. I remember going to vote with my father in this hospital. It later became the site of the Ford Foundation building. And it was a massive undertaking, one of the biggest projects that had happened in New York until that time. This beautiful drawing gives you a little feeling of the kind of heroic effort that was involved in building on this promontory. Basically, they tore down most but not all of the old townhouse buildings, row house buildings, and then straddled what had been this opening, streetcars coming and traffic coming through 42nd Street. This is an important shot because it explains really the entire premise of the project. there was a new massive center of New York City. No one knows more about this than Carol Willis, that had just emerged. Wall Street had always been the center of New York, lower Manhattan, but starting around 1915, a rival had emerged in East Midtown around Grand Central Terminal, with the newest and tallest office buildings in New York going up at an incredible clip, and hotels and clubs and other buildings. And this was the new center of activity, and the notion was, what if we could have a residential community where people could walk to their office buildings around Grand Central Terminal. And in fact, that was a big part of the ad campaigns. You gain an hour of time. You do not have to take the number 7 line all the way to Jackson Heights. You'll have a whole new freedom. There was something else about the project, however, that is related to this, which was, this has to do with the fact that the buildings were hotel buildings in part, some of them were not. But I'd like to think of it in broader terms. This is where Sex and the City starts. This is the new idea that there's a young, white-collar, not particularly affluent, but definitely white-collar. These are not factory workers. They work in these new office buildings. Maybe they're in advertising, other kinds of white-collar activities. They are young. They are not going to stay in New York long. They're here to be here, to meet someone, to get married, and to move out. And it's the kind of world of young New Yorkers, young, attractive, white-collar New Yorkers. So you could say that sort of Sarah Jessica Parker land, basically, is what these were built. We're going to talk about the small apartments and so forth. And so it went up amazingly quickly, within about 4 or 5 years, with these landscaped grounds, and this was through one of the 3 big buildings along what had been renamed Tudor City Place. And this was another major tower called the Woodstock in the center of the project. And you can see the architecture, we'll talk a bit about it, varied, but all of it had this kind of Tudor theme. This building obviously feels a little more like classical kind of Hugh Ferris setbacks. So I'm going to present 3 propositions, urban design propositions, about the project. And I'm going to say them now, and then I'm going to bring them back at the very end as I tell you after I've told you a little bit about the project. My first proposition is that Tudor City contradicts what I believe is a false modernist dichotomy, that we must somehow choose between the values of vital and dense urban life on the one hand, or sunlight, ventilation, and greenery on the other. This was a fundamental schism of 20th century urbanism promulgated by Le Corbusier and everyone else, that you had to, I guess I will go back, that you had to choose somehow between fun, diverse, lively, vital, dense cities and a kind of vision of greenery. It wasn't really suburban, it wasn't about private ownership necessarily, but it was definitely about the idea of open space and sunlight and greenery, and that those were the supreme values, and all that other stuff had to make way for it. Gone with the shops, gone with the density, gone with the streets, all gone for this new vision. Proposition number 2, that Tudor City, along with its contemporary, not often compared to, but I will argue very similar, offers an incredibly valuable alternative to the superblock, the core idea of the modern redevelopment program. It's a multi-block development that retains the street grid, fits into the existing city, and instead uses consistent architecture to offer a reinvented urban environment across a large swath of the city. So it is neither a single building on a single lot, nor is it a modernist superblock. It is something more intricate and complex that, in my view, combines the best aspects of large-scale redevelopment that the superblock offered with fine-grained life and diversity and complexity that the traditional city offered, and some other values I'll get to. Also, like Rockefeller Center, proposition number 3 proposes, Tudor City adapts but reimagines and elevates the essential urbanism of New York. The basic sort of compact, you might say, of New York. Compact private spaces, which allow density and vitality, are compensated by gracious, extensive public spaces and stylish urbane amenities. It's the basic deal you make when you move to New York or a city like New York. Your place of living is going to be smaller than it could be in the suburbs, but you will get all this kind of stuff that you will never get in the suburbs. You will get Central Park, and you'll get the East River, and you'll get the Brooklyn Bridge, and you'll get the lively streets, and the great shops, and the good places to eat. And I think that what's brilliant about Tudor City is it takes that basic premise that basic idea of why did you move to New York in the first place, and refines it and elevates it and makes it all that it could be. The plan is really interesting. Basically, French and his partners bought up a lot of properties, as I say, not all of them. They took advantage of this pre-existing street, but really remade it in their sort of own image. The three great towers are here, here, and here. The Windsor, the Tudor, and the Prospect. You could hold a gun to my head, and I would never forget these. The Manor, the Hermitage, and the cloisters up at the top. And some of the other buildings here, I won't go into all of them. I grew up in Tudor City Place, which was a later addition to the project, where there had been located some tennis courts that we're going to actually see. And as you see, First Avenue was here, Second Avenue here. Remember, Second Avenue has an elevated line running on this when it's built, so you don't really want to be on that too much either. But they're basically creating two large parks with actually, in those days, a little central area park as well. Now, just one of the fantastic things about Tudor City as a model for urban development is it mixes an amazing diversity of incomes, of apartments. Basically, the three big, massive apartment houses had very inexpensive, very small studio and one-bedroom apartments with this kind of hotel for those youngins, the ones who are 23, 24 years old, getting their first jobs out of school. The buildings along the north side, and some along the south side later as well, were more bigger apartments for families, more expensive and larger and appropriate for families. And finally, up at the top of these huge apartments, of these huge buildings, they built some spectacular upper end apartments, just everything you would ever dream of living in New York. So very quietly and without much fuss, they're mixing the rich, the middle class, and the, not poor exactly, but sort of up and coming, certainly modest in their income levels. And they're doing it it's just creating kind of a diverse urban environment. They're not separating people, there's no poor door, there's nothing like that. It just does it. It just brings the diversity of the city together. Here, I'll go through it with you. These are the kind of apartments in the big apartment houses. These were the famous small apartments of Tudor City. I always remember, we lived in a rather large, modern apartment, and I always remember visiting all my friends. But yes, you and two other girls could live here. And what was famous, and you can see the sort of compact proportions, they do the old interior designer trick of having a mirrored surface to make it look a little bigger. But you see very large windows and very well ventilated. There are a lot of air and light. What was sort of notorious about them was that they had no kitchens. They had these funny little service pantries, which of course makes all the sense in the world if you think of it as a hotel, but was really an issue. It was kind of funny. And I grew up with, by the time I lived there in the early 60s, there were families, real families living there, and those poor moms in those days trying to make family meals in this little tiny kitchenette, this little service pantry. I mean, it was sort of dreamy you sort of imagine the martini shaker and the sort of Nick and Nora, you know, let's have martinis. But that was an issue for those apartments, but it kept the size of them very small and allowed them to achieve these really pretty amazing densities. We asked Leo to calculate the densities, and we came up with, what was the number? It was incredible, 1,203 people per acre if you count only the private property. Okay, so that's not really, I mean the buildings, okay. That's not fair. You have to count the streets and you have to count the parks, because
The
in
parks are counted in the 1,200.
the 1,200, but not the streets.
inside.
Okay, so that's pretty impressive right there. Add in the streets, and you're still at almost 787, at almost 800, which is easily comparable. I want to kind of go back to this slide. Easily comparable to the Knickerbocker Village or to London Terrace. With, however, I would like to make an extremely important point. Have you ever been inside London Terrace or Knickerbocker Village? Those courtyards are not nice places to be. You're at the bottom of a swimming pool. They are dark, they are compressed and unpleasant, and they don't get much sunlight. They do serve the sort of technical needs of what they're supposed to do, but I would never want to hang out there. The parts of Tudor City are always lighted, always sunlit on the coldest day. They are always pleasant places to sit. They are broad and spacious and wonderful. So they that has to be remembered. If you want to compare it in the other way to a NYCHA project, typical polo grounds is 268 people per acre. This is 3 times the density, all right, of a NYCHA project. Moving on, talking about those magnificent, so that was one of the kind of wonderful other ideas of Tudor City, that, okay, you have this huge shaft, we're going to have this kind of wonderful top, a la Beaux-Arts, kind of tripartite design. But this isn't just an ornamental top. They put in these fantastic apartments up here. And this whole fantasy land of rooftop gardens and spaces, which created a kind of, it was one of the things you bought. It was that idea, you know, when we talk about kind of public space and the value of public space, it isn't just literally the parks. It isn't just the places to be. It's the public collective imagination. And this gave you a kind of a vision, a fantasy. You would walk to your house every day and you'd look up, as I did when I would go to sleep, to these amazing spires and this incredible landscape. And in fact, these astonishing duplex, get ready, duplex apartments, which are still there, are now getting many millions of dollars apiece. One of my childhood memories, do you remember some awful cologne called Hawaii, you know what was it called? High Karate. And I watched High Karate commercial, which is still available, by the way, on the web, being photographed in this very apartment from the balcony. But look at that, kind of, could there be any dreamier idea of the way you might live in New York and what New York was about? Okay, we didn't go to these apartments all the time, but they were there, and we knew they were there, and they were part of our world. Also, it created this incredible collective, amazing environment on several of the buildings of sunning areas, which were used very, very well used, and you can see here with these kind of magnificent views, and the kind of getting a double benefit of the kind of wonderful architecture now seen from the inside, sort of giving you this special frame, and also, by the way, making you feel totally comfortable to be there on the roof and not like you were going to fall off. But of course, the pride of Tudor City was its parks, and is its parks. These astonishing public spaces, these landscape gardens that were out every window that you could see from almost any apartment, which were both very large and impressive in scale, and beautifully detailed and beautifully thought through. And of course, think of the value that they gave. First of all, they framed the apartment houses. You could look back, everything Corbusier complained about in New York. You would never see the buildings because you couldn't stand back. Well, here you could. You could actually see that wonderful architecture in a way that almost, very rarely, certainly in Manhattan, you get the opportunity to do. Full frontal, looking from a beautiful space. And of course, second value, they added to the value of the apartments because you look down on these marvelous gardens. It was incredible, instead of the typical New York. And this is why, by the way, my father moved us here. He said he hated that. He said, no matter how much money you spend in Manhattan, you still just seem to see a building across the street, unless you literally live in a penthouse. Whereas here, every apartment, every single apartment in this complex had this view, just about, maybe a couple. And they went beyond that. There was certainly in the early days of the project a kind of notion of a kind of above and beyond elegance of the landscaping, beautifully trimmed with a whole kind of fancy environment. I'm not ever, what would be the word, cynical about this sort of thing. I mean, sure, is it kind of absurd that there's a Tudor-style little cottage in the middle of Manhattan in 1931? Sure, but you know what? It's fantastic, and it worked beautifully. And it was a beautifully, fully conceived, and elegantly designed, and exquisitely detailed, so that there was a kind of when you grew up there was kind of a feeling of living in the most precious place. They were also kind of fascinating and allowed for kind of all sorts of fascinating specialty things. Okay, the tennis courts didn't last. My building replaced them in 1956, but there they were. And by the way, they had some apparently serious seated tennis players playing there in the 1950s. This, however, I remember very well. This was, I should point out, looking at the park, the parks were differentiated. There was even when I was a kid, the grown-ups park and the kids park. The South Park was the grown-ups park, and you can see it was laid out much more as a kind of formal garden, much more a park for seeing and observing and being. And the North Park was the more active park, and that was the children's park. And in the children's park was the children's playground, which they had actually sort of put in an area, kind of recessed and used, I guess, this wall. I'm not sure if it had been built for this, but they took advantage of it so that the noise of the children didn't disturb people beyond it. And they had this, all this, I must say, when I was a kid, this was no longer found. It was a sandbox. But I remember it well. It's where I spent my childhood. And there was another thing about the parks. True to this day, that they did provide classically the social and community centers, so hard to achieve in New York. The dream, I think, of those housing projects, almost never achieved in the housing project. But this really worked, because this really was like the embrace of the buildings around the central parks that everyone looked at, you walked out your door, there they were, and they were the thing you shared with everybody else. And whether it was the Christmas tree that was lighted every day, every Christmas in the South Park, or events and parties, and I looked in the histories, they used to have dance thing, there were all kinds of programming. Some of that's gone by the way, but they still have the Christmas tree, and this was taken maybe a year ago. It's still a place where people come together and get to know their neighbors. That's a pretty nice value. There was a kind of wonderful, they carried the theme, the Tudor theme, to absurd but absolutely wonderful lengths. This are the street fronts. So this is another point. I mean, you can kid about like all this kind of stuff, and it was kind of wonderful. And by the way, it says it was built by Fred French here. That's what Fred French. And there were these something about they found a Hessian sword when they were excavating for this building, which was, I guess, true. So beyond the whimsy of the project, I want to point out that there was enormous attention paid to the streetscape. So even though there was this greenery and this concept of green, the streets were real streets and the sidewalks were real sidewalks. And Tudor City Place was a real and wonderful street to walk down. And as you walked, it was full of incident, and still is, these kind of wonderful Gothic trefoils and things like that. And here you get the feeling as you walk down the street. It is not a dull and boring walk. It has incident and variety and all the qualities that we would love in a, let's say, Fifth Avenue apartment house, including, planting out front and so forth. Except once again, remember, this was affordable housing. Now, of course, one of the other qualities I want to point out to, it was urbane. This was another thing that got lost in the modernist epoch. The idea of urbanity, the idea that city was something more than a lot of people living in the same place with a kind of functional, mechanistic idea. The idea that there were possibilities to urban life, that there was an excitement to urban life, that urban life had a kind of wonderful magical quality that couldn't be achieved in lower density places, sort of went away. And in fact, in the case of NYCHA, was actively discouraged. I mean, you just have to face it. They only with the greatest reluctance put shops on the edge of their projects. They did not like the idea of shops. They did not like the idea of street life. It was the old things of the kids hanging out in the street corners and everything Jane Jacobs later criticized about them as that was true. Tudor City was urbane. I've shown you in some of the other images. But of course, one of the reasons it was urbane was it had a lot of places to eat and drink. It had to, because those apartments didn't have any kitchens. So it had to have, think of it as a hotel, right? So you go downstairs, except here, instead of being the lobby of the hotel with some nice bars and restaurants, it was a city of bars and restaurants. Where shall we go? That is from there. There were a variety, again, very thoughtful, very alert to both sort of, let's call it social and class differences, but also urban possibilities. So there was a coffee house that was pretty inexpensive, and then there was kind of a mid-range restaurant, which was still there when I was a kid, now Limpero, very fancy place. Fantastic bar, I guess, looks like out of an ocean liner. And again, this is the idea not only that different groups of people with different budgets might want different kinds of places to eat, but also that on a Friday night, you might want to go out and have a more fancier experience than you had on a Tuesday. And again, what the attraction of the city is. Summed up for me in this beautiful drawing, we saw it a little earlier, but I want to blow it up. And this kind of magical idea. Nowhere except New York, right? I mean, it's urban, it's high-rise, it's skyscrapers, really. These are steel frame, 20-something story, I've forgotten exactly how story buildings, but with this kind of wonderful offset by these beautiful gardens. Okay, maybe a little romanticized here with this, but still not unlike my actual memories of this place in the evening. So I want to come back to and open up and we'll end with this thing, opening up the false schism. You know, the idea that it had to be like this was the version of basically the drawing that Carol showed, except this is an actual photograph of the Lower East Side when fully 1 million people lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, you can imagine. And the idea that sure, the streets are bustling, the streets are dense. No, because look at the backyards. There are no backyards. This is from Dead Ends at Sylvia City, like filming. But the idea that, of course, there's no other place for life to go. There's no healthful thing. So you have to have this vitality, but at what cost? You know, the terrible loss. And that somehow, if you didn't have that, you had to have this. You had to have all the street grid, everything pulled away, a field of greenery, repetitive slab towers placed on a field of greenery with no streets, no sidewalks, no shops, no, you know, different times of day uses. And more importantly, though, a kind of idea that, you know, the new man will live here, you know, the new improved man and woman of tomorrow. You had to live up to this bloody thing. You had to be part of it. They didn't give you any of the old things that you loved about New York. You had to be the new 20th century man. And I would argue that Tudor City puts that completely, sees that for the idiocy that it is. Why can't you have all the greenery that you would have in any NYCHA housing project and have a lovely streetscape with urban life and lovely shops and all the things that you want out of city life? It's an absurd schism, and I think Tudor City is one of the grandest sort of, revokes it in the grandest possible way. Premise 2 about Rockefeller Center. They're not often bare, but to me they're fascinatingly sane. Even though, you know, the homeliness of Tudor City compared to the elegance and sophistication of Rockefeller Center. But urbanistically, they are almost identical. They are neither super block projects that wipe away the city, nor are they one by one little houses on a lot with the existing grid. They take the grid, they confront it, they remake it, they rethink it, but they do not lose it. They keep it. They improve it. They not only take the traditional streets, which pass right through them without any problem. Somebody once said, or maybe it was me, you can walk right through the projects without having to do anything. You don't have to become a new kind of person. It doesn't expect or ask anything of you. It's just good old New York. Side streets going through, just walk right through. If you find something nice while you do it, that's great, but you're not expected to become a new person. It actually improves and makes finer grain that grid by adding a new street. Okay, in Tudor City there was this existing street, but they treated it in this beautiful way, not unlike the way Rockefeller Center did, with lots of built fabric surrounding an open space. And so, so it strikes me that the projects are extraordinary, and the value of the idea, well, one final point, it holds together. It's a thing, it's a place, it's Rockefeller Center, it's Tudor City. But it doesn't insist on doing that in this dumb-headed way of wiping away everything else. It lets this fine-grained urban thing go through it, and then it uses architecture to remake the environment. So you know, even though I said, sure, you could just walk through it and it doesn't ask anything of you, you certainly know when you're walking through Rockefeller Center, and you certainly know when you're walking through Tudor City. A couple of other interesting implications of that. One is, you can integrate the past or the future very easily. You didn't have to tear down the old houses. They just sat there perfectly nicely in relationship. This was empty my whole childhood. It was the haunted house when I was a kid. And it's one of the old pre-existing row houses that French wasn't able to get his hands on. But no problem, it just sits there. So, you know, there's a kind of fine-grained intersection with the existing city that is not catastrophic. And finally, you know, coming back to this point, you know, this basic idea, to me, it's taking the basic idea that we all live with and we all exist, the small apartment, but really going, hey, what if we really rethought the possibilities of every level of urban life? Think of that rooftop sunning and those wonderful apartments, and think of those parks and all the other, and that little pool, and this amazing level of detail. And this is not a minor rethinking of New York City. This is a significant rethinking of New York City and what its opportunities are, as is this. There's nothing lack of ambition here. It's as dramatic in its way as any super block housing project. It's simply done in a way that just allows the city to breathe and allows you to be part of it, and recaptures and reimagines everything that we already love about cities. Thanks very much.
James, do you think that Tudor City might have become a model moving forward had not the Depression befallen the fortunes of Fred French? Even the plan for the Lower East Side plan for Knickerbocker Village, which has about the same density as Tudor City, if we want to use about 800 people an acre, was another way to reinvent there in situ on the Lower East Side a modern city by replacing the context of those dense urban blocks. Do you think it would have worked? Do you think,
it's such a great question. I know it's a big theme of Nick's. I mean, let's think about it. Well, Tudor City had some special advantages. It was bad land very close to a very magnetic place. There are certainly other places in New York that are like that, but the great swaths of redevelopment that went on in the 1950s and 60s were generally not in places like that. Secondly, it was, the eclectic architecture, of course, presumably would have been one of the things that it's hard to recreate, obviously, nowadays, is we don't build like this anymore. We don't think we should build like this anymore. We would, it's considered kitsch and all those words that are used to talk about that kind of architecture. So there would be the issue of what would a stripped down version of that look like. But I think that in principle it could have been, it was at the scale with 3,000 apartments. That was not unlike the scale of actually some of the larger developments. You could imagine Mitchell-Lama or projects that were intended to appeal to the middle class. However, by the 40s and 50s, the urge toward bigger apartments and to more family life orientation. This was really a product of its era, which has never gone away. There are young people who come to New York to this day and they all cram into little places and it makes New York go. But certainly in terms of, government subsidized and government assisted housing, I don't know, that's hard to imagine. But could French have gone on and made 4 more, 5 more, 10 more Tudor cities? It's possible.
And Richard, so the outward movement to the suburbs with a reasonably high density solution, which might have gotten more so if elevator buildings were embraced as the model to expand upon. Absent the Depression, do you think that would have transformed the landscape of New York? A private investment like the Chateau, like the towers.
Well, the intervening thing is the actual suburbs, and all that planning started in the New Deal, and then it's played out hugely, of course, in the 50s. So, I think things were caught up in that. And the money side is a difficult issue. I think that, if you follow the money, it's obviously in the suburbs, there's huge government subsidies there. It was I don't know if you agree with this, for social housing, particular types, which were, I haven't seen any dissertation on this yet, but I think were extremely profitable, like projects, actually. They were cheap. It was a cheap idea.
Sure.
But
For the contract, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They make money, and that's how they got it through Congress.
Yeah.
It was the promise.
Sure.
And so, so like a Tudor City, I think is like at the end of it gets terminated by this stuff.
Well, one thing I failed to explain about Fred French is that he developed the French plan, which was an innovative financing model to sell small stocks to individual investors for a dividend, a repayment of a dividend of 6%. So it was like the stock market in real estate, where he fashioned a successful model. Of course, he went bankrupt in the end too. So I don't know how successful it would have continued to be even through if the boom of the 20s had continued. But the French plan, and there's a book of the French plan in that case right there, laid out a way that individual investors could buy small-scale stock certificates, clip coupons in effect, in order to get a 6% revenue payback, which was decent at the time, and then share in any profits that the success of the overall project generated. And that fell apart with the Depression as well. So it's hard to tell if that would have worked as a financing model or as an alternative capitalist version of rebuilding.
Can I build on James? I love your presentation, and I will say this, I don't think it's too late. I think we're looking at not just the NYCHA projects, but also the middle income. We have Penn South. A lot of these large-scale, Co-op City, a lot of them are reaching that point now where either they're like big choices have to be made about sort of just preserving them as is or redevelopment. And I think actually what I really like about the presentation is I think that the language that a lot of city leaders are using about redevelopment is too limited. That is, it's very quantitative in its approach. It's like, we need money, so we have to do these things, or we need more units. And what I loved about your presentation was you showed you can get more money, you can get more units if you think about, right? You can do this in a way that actually makes a neighborhood a better place. And I actually don't think that language is really should be at the fore of all the basically the pressure for kinds of redevelopment. I think they would get further on that rather than saying, if you don't do this, you know, the places are going to fall down, or you know, it's going to be a massive crisis, and we need the money. We need more units. We got to stick more units on your property. Well, guess what? You can actually have lots of units on a property in an absolutely beautiful environment. And I want to confirm. I just took a walk around Tudor City the other day, and it's still gorgeous. You know, it's a really great model of urbanism. And we were talking also about Park West Village the other day, where they've actually added some middle income project, where they've added stores and more dense housing and all kinds of things on the edge of big super blocks. And guess what? It's weird. It's almost magnetic, like you're saying. Like it sort of like attracts people to that upper part of Columbus now. It's a very interesting experience, right? So I think there is actually tremendous potential in the city for a kind of, you know, enhanced urbanism. But I do think they're going to have to figure out how to talk about it in a different way.
I mean, to go just thinking a little bit more as everybody's making these great comments, you know, the above the first floor and below the 27th or whatever it was floor, there's a lot of repetition in those units. Those are the same apartments again and again, and broadly not different than NYCHA. You know, the layouts were different and so forth. But
much smaller in terms
smaller
of the number of square feet.
But I'm thinking not so much about that as I'm thinking about the
units.
economies of scale.
Right.
I'm thinking about, you put a little flourish at the top and a little flourish at the bottom and some nicely conceived open space, and voila, you know, you've redeemed what is in fact 27 floors of identical apartments in a big modern steel frame building. That's one thought. And the other is more successfully, I think, than really almost any other project in the city, your old argument that height and in and of itself, that height and bulk are not intrinsically bad. And that you can, you know, it shows those apartment buildings are enormous. They're gigantic, they're big, they're 200 feet long. The last one, the Windsor, is about 120 feet deep, or 140 feet deep, or something like that. They're just big, bulky, massive blocks of building, and yet they seem gracious and elegant, and you don't look at them and go, oh my God, you know, it would be hard to, you know, when you hear people saying we can't build over like 6 stories, you can show them, actually, you can build to 35 stories if you do it right.
Well, it should be footnoted that those buildings would be against the zoning law today, right? And at the time, they didn't conform to the tenement house law for residents. The point that I made before, if you had a kitchen, you were a tenement, even if you were a Park Avenue apartment. If you didn't have a kitchen, if you had this little service area, then you could qualify as a hotel, which took you out of the the height limitation and into the bulk limitation. And it's not, I think much more work needs to be done in Tudor City because it's not clear to me at all how those are within any kind of sky plane or anything else. But today, or in those days, you couldn't build apartments to this height. Today, after the 1961 zoning and then the changes, you can't build to that height. And by New York State law, you can only have 12 FAR. So it is not possible to build those buildings under current law. However, it is possible to make better urbanism with increasing density.
Or to think outside the box. I mean, here the last few years, the whole micro unit explosion that's gone on the Carmel Place project, and architects did.
Right
in that, well, not that dissimilar. Imagine, with the notion that for young people in New York, for a couple of years, you don't want to raise a family of 6 there, but for a couple of years, it's 300 square feet is totally doable.
That's right.
People do it all the time.
300 square feet is the typical size of a tenement unit with probably up to 10 family boarders.
Well, 400 square feet has been reduced. It was 400, now it's whatever they get away with, I think. But I think that what's important to understand is that this was done at the same time as now when the nature of production in the city was changing. You had the enormous growth of service industry, and you actually had a market for these apartments. And I guess you could say maybe the micro unit thing is somehow engaging the same sort of change. Who knows, we're too close to it maybe. But the unit thing is interesting. NYCHA units are much better. NYCHA units are actually good.
Yeah, sure.
We have built the TAP unit over there.
Right.
You'll see it's quite spacious.
Yeah,
And
sure.
that's one reason
Twice the size of the Tudor
we
City.
often talk about, people say, well, why do people defend, NYCHA projects so much, or they don't want changes? Well, for those who happen to be lucky enough to live in them, quite frankly, they're quite, and they also have a lot of, you talk about, there are very few apartments in New York where you're not looking at a wall. Well, NYCHA units are a lot of those units. You have great views very often over water and so forth. So there's a lot to basically talk to people about redevelopment. I think you really have to be more than like, well, you have to, again, this is get back to that issue, is that it's not, it can't be a kind of threat of like, well, you're going to lose your building if you don't do what we say, right? There has to be an aspirational development. Like, we can make these places better, and I really feel like that has to be the discussion. I'd love to see you present to NYCHA leadership and NYCHA tenant groups with a slightly different take on certain elements. But I think there actually is a lot of frustration. For instance, I've talked to NYCHA residents over the years, and that there isn't enough shopping in a lot of where they are. The grounds are not safe at night, and those kinds of things. And because of the loss of the kind of informal storekeepers and things like that, they're not performing at a level that they could be. I remember years ago doing the initial research, and I just went to here, and it's like, after a while I was looking at all these projects, and I realized that after a while, it's like, well, where are the bars? There's not a single, I would bet there's not a single bar
It's allowed.
in a NYCHA project. And you're talking about fun in the city, that just tells you what the reformers, right, when they were rebuilding neighborhoods, like, these are neighborhoods full of bars. If you see like the tenement neighborhoods, there's bars everywhere, it's something like, to go from that, now you gotta be a better person.
The better man.
The better person.
Right.
Home with the family at night.
Better man and the better
Home with the family at night.
The Corbusier, person who's going to work out all day and all that.
The lack of commercial was by law.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
They did.
absolutely.
And in fact, NYCHA leaders try.
37 Housing Act, you
Yeah.
could not put shops in there because Congress, from another great wisdom, thought it was some form of communism to actually make a space for somebody to have a business in. And that was reinforced in 48. And you've got, how many people? 450 or whoever's counting.
But they could have done some little
shop.
things. They could have left, for instance, there were choices that were made about blocks. They could have left, like you were talking about with Tudor City. And in fact, they made little deals because they had these problems. They knew about the federal law, so they said, well, we'll add a store that's not on the site, so it's not the federal money. They did that.
Yeah.
But I think they were ultimately they were a little bit hostile to stores.
They were very hostile to stores.
Yeah.
I think there was, the stuff Richard has documented so well, this ancient enmity that goes back to the 1860s and 1870s, that, you know, the Irish working men are spending all their money at the pub, you know, the bar at night, and those poor Irish mothers and, you know, whatever. And those kids are gonna, you know, go into the bar and whatever. And this was deep rooted. And it's how they sold projects in the first place.
The zero crime, the deserving poor, they would only pull those who were not alcoholics or not drug addicts.
So we have an abundance of expertise up here, and we could go on talking about this forever, and obviously we will probably the rest of our lives. I'm just going to bring it back to details about density for nerds, and something to think about when you come back and you look at the exhibition in order to absorb some of the history that gets very complicated about what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. But as a thought exercise, to take the examples of density, both of these two types of the lot coverage that we talked about tonight, but also the population density, and take a look at the Taft houses, where a one-bedroom unit is 720 feet. And the lot density of the Taft housing project, which is right over there that you see in the Harlem district, is 20% lot coverage. And think about Tudor City model and other models like London Terrace, where the population density is 900 or 1,000 people per acre, and the lot coverage is about 68%. NYCHA projects could easily take double the density in terms of lot coverage, put in double the density in terms of population, and it still wouldn't reach the desirable character of Tudor City, London Terrace, and others.
Because it wasn't off the beaten track and it wasn't the greatest area, how well did it sell at the beginning?
Tudor City? Oh, I think it filled up the
I
percentage.
know since it happened.
People stayed in place. They grew, I think some of those couples never moved. They were the parents of my friends, frankly, in the 60s, and they'd been living there for decades. And they were a real mix of people. But yes, I think it did very well right from the start. And I think the prices were low enough so it remained attractive even during, it opened, I mean, it was finished roughly in 1930, so it just hit the Depression. I think it had rented up substantially by then, but I think it was inexpensive enough that it never had enormous vacancies, at least not the sense you get.
Same for